Chapter 2. The Jacobites and the Irish People. If there was a time when it behoved men in public stations to be explicit, if ever there was a time when those scourges of the human race called politicians should lay aside their duplicity and finesse, it is the present moment. Be assured that the people of this country will no longer bear that their welfare should be the sport of a few family factions. Be assured they are convinced their true interest consists in putting down men of self-creation, who have no object in view but that of aggrandizing themselves and their families at the expense of the public, and in setting up men who shall represent the nation, who shall be accountable to the nation, and who shall do the business of the nation. Arthur O'Connor, in Irish House of Commons, May 4th, 1795. Modern Irish history, properly understood, may be said to start with the close of the Williamite Wars in the year 1691. All the political life of Ireland during the next 200 years draws its colouring from, and can only be understood in the light of that conflict between King James of England and William, Prince of Orange. Our Irish politics, even to this day and generation, have been and are largely determined by the light in which the different sections of the Irish people regard the prolonged conflict which started with the surrender of Sarsfield and the garrison of Limerick to the investing forces of the Williamite party. Yet never, in all the history of Ireland, has there been a war in which the people of Ireland had less reason to be interested either on one side or the other. It is unfortunately beyond all question that the Irish Catholics of that time did fight for King James like lions. It is beyond all question that the Irish Catholics shed their blood like water and wasted their wealth like dirt in an effort to retain King James upon the throne. But it is equally beyond question that the whole struggle was no earthly concern of theirs, that King James was one of the most worthless representatives of a worthless race that ever sat upon a throne, that the pious, glorious, and immortal William was a mere adventurer fighting for his own hand, and his army recruited from the impecunious swordsmen of Europe, who cared as little for Protestantism as they did for human life, and that neither army had the slightest claim to be considered as a patriot army combating for the freedom of the Irish race. So far from the paeans of praise lavished upon Sarsfield and the Jacobite army being justified, it is questionable whether a more enlightened or patriotic age than our own will not condemn them as little better than traitors for their action in seducing the Irish people from their allegiance to the cause of their country's freedom, to plunge them into a war on behalf of a foreign tyrant, a tyrant who, even in the midst of their struggles on his behalf, opposed the Dublin Parliament in its efforts to annul the supremacy of the English Parliament. The war between William and James offered a splendid opportunity to the subject people of Ireland to make a bid for freedom, while the forces of their oppressors were rent in a civil war. The opportunity was cast aside, and the subject people took sides on behalf of the opposing factions of their enemies. The reason is not hard to find. The Catholic gentlemen and nobles who had the leadership of the people of Ireland at the time were, one and all, men who possessed considerable property in the country, property to which they had, notwithstanding their Catholicity, no more right or title than the merest Cromwellian or Williamite adventurer. The lands they held were lands which in former times belonged to the Irish people. In other words, they were tribe lands. As such, the peasantry, then reduced to the position of mere tenants at will, were the rightful owners of the soil, whilst the Jacobite chivalry of King James were either the descendants of men who had obtained their property in some former confiscation as the spoils of conquest, or men who had taken sides with the oppressor against their own countrymen and were allowed to retain their property as the fruits of treason, or finally of men who had consented to seek from the English government a grant giving them a personal title to the lands of their clansmen. For such a combination no really national action could be expected, and from first to last of their public proceedings they acted as an English faction, and as an English faction only. In whatever point they might disagree with the Williamites, they were at least in perfect accord with them on one point, viz., that the Irish people should be a subject people, and it will be readily understood that even had the war ended in the complete defeat of William and the triumph of James, the lot of the Irish, whether as tillers of the soil or as a nation, would not have been substantially improved. The undeniable patriotism of the rank and file does not alter the truthfulness of this analysis of the situation. They saw only the new enemy from England, the old English enemy settled in Ireland. They were generously, but foolishly, ready to credit with all the virtues and attributes of patriotic Irishmen. To further illustrate our point regarding the character of the Jacobite leaders in Ireland, we might adduce the result of the great land settlement of Ireland in 1675. 11 million acres had been surveyed at the time, of which 4 million acres were in the possession of Protestant settlers as the result of previous confiscations. Lands so held were never disturbed, but the remainder were distributed as follows. Acres, to soldiers who had served in the Irish Wars, 2,367,715. To 49 officers, 497,001. To adventurers who had lent money, 707,321. To provisors to whom land had been promised, 477,873. To the Duke of Ormond and Colonel Butler, 257,518. To the Duke of York, 169,436. To Protestant bishops, 31,526. The lands left to the Catholics were distributed among the Catholic gentlemen as follows. To those who were declared innocent, that is to say, those who fought for freedom but had sided with the government, 1,176,750. To provisors, land promised, 497,001. Nominees in possession, 68,260. Restitutions, 55,396. To those transferred to Connacht under James I, 541,330. It will thus be seen that with the exception of the lands held in Connacht, all the lands held by the Catholic gentry throughout Ireland were lands gained in the manner that we have before described, as spoils of conquest or the fruits of treachery. Even in that province the lands of the gentry were held under a feudal tenure from the English crown, and therefore their owners had entered into a direct agreement with the invader to set aside the rights of the clan community in favour of their own personal claims. Here then was the real reason for the refusal of the Irish leaders of that time to raise the standard of the Irish nation instead of the banner of the English faction. They fought, not for freedom for Ireland, nor for the restitution of their rights to the Irish people, but rather to secure that the class who then enjoyed the privilege of robbing the Irish people should not be compelled to give way in their turn to a fresh horde of land thieves. Much has been made of their attempt to repeal Poyning's law, and in other ways to give greater legislative force to the resolutions of the Dublin Parliament, as if such acts were a proof of their sincere desire to free the country, and not merely to make certain their own tenure of power. But such claims, on the part of some writers, are only another proof of the difficulty of comprehending historical occurrences without having some central principle to guide and direct the task. For the benefit of our readers, we may have set forth the socialist key to the pages of history, in order that it may be more readily understood why in the past the governing classes have ever and always aimed at the conquest of political power as the guarantee for their economic domination, or, to put it more plainly, for the social subjection of the masses, and why the freedom of the workers, even in a political sense, must be incomplete and insecure until they wrest from the governing classes the possession of the land and instruments of wealth production. This proposition, or key to history, as set forth by Karl Marx, the greatest of modern thinkers and first of scientific socialists, is as follows: that in every historical epoch the prevailing method of economic production and exchange and the social organization necessarily following from it forms the basis upon which alone can be explained the political and intellectual history of that epoch. In Ireland at the time of the Williamite War, the prevailing method of economic production and exchange was the feudal method, based upon the private ownership of lands stolen from the Irish people, and all the political struggles of the period were built upon the material interests of one set of usurpers who wished to retain, and another set who wished to obtain, the mastery of those lands. In other words, the application of such a key as the above to the problem furnished by the Jacobite Parliament of King James at once explains the reason of the so-called patriotic efforts of the Catholic gentry. Their efforts were directed to the conservation of their own rights of property, as against the right of the English Parliament to interfere with or regulate such rights. The so-called Patriot Parliament was, in reality, like every other parliament that ever sat in Dublin, merely a collection of land thieves and their lackeys. Their patriotism consisted in an effort to retain for themselves the lands of the native peasantry. The English influence against which they protested was the influence of their fellow thieves in England, hungry for a share of the spoil. And Sarsfield and his followers did not become patriots because of their fight against King William's government any more than an Irish Whig out of his office becomes a patriot because of his hatred to the Tories who are in. The forces which battled beneath the walls of Derry or Limerick were not the forces of England and Ireland, but the forces of two English political parties fighting for the possession of the powers of government. And the leaders of the Irish wild geese on the battlefield of Europe were not shedding their blood because of their fidelity to Ireland, as our historians pretend to believe, but because they had attached themselves to the defeated side in English politics. This fact was fully illustrated by the action of the old Franco-Irish at the time of the French Revolution. They, in a body, volunteered into the English army to help put down the new French Republic, and as a result, Europe witnessed the spectacle of the new Republican Irish exiles fighting for the French Revolution, and the sons of the old aristocratic Irish exiles fighting under the banner of England to put down that revolution. It is time we learn to appreciate and value the truth upon such matters, and to brush from our eyes the cobwebs woven across them by our ignorant or unscrupulous history-writing politicians. On the other hand, it is just as necessary to remember that King William, when he had finally subdued his enemies in Ireland, showed by his actions that he and his followers were animated throughout by the same class feeling and considerations as their opponents. When the war was over, William confiscated 1.5 million acres and distributed them among the aristocratic plunderers who followed him as follows. He gave Lord Bentinck 135,300 acres, Lord Albemarle 103,603, Lord Coningsby 59,667, Lord Romney 49,517, Lord Galway 36,142, Lord Athlone 26,840, Lord Rochford 49,512, Dr. Leslie 16,000, Mr. F. Keeley 12,000, Lord Mountjoy 12,000, Sir T. Prendergast 7,083, Colonel Hamilton 5,886 acres. These are a few of the men whose descendants some presumably sane Irishmen imagine will be converted into nationalists by preaching a union of classes. It must not be forgotten also, if only as proof of his religious sincerity, that King William bestowed 95,000 acres, plundered from the Irish people, upon his paramour, Elizabeth Villiers, Countess of Orkney. But the virtuous Irish Parliament interfered, took back the land, and distributed it among their immediate friends, the Irish Loyalist adventurers.